Welcome back to our online video Bible study on the book of Ezekiel. In this particular video, we're going to be looking at part of the content that occurs in chapters 8 through 11 of the book of Ezekiel, but we'll be focusing our attention on what is recorded in Ezekiel chapter 8, which is where Ezekiel sees a vision of all sorts of idolatry going on in the temple in Jerusalem. I'm Pastor Philip Hoppe. I'm glad to be with you today as we continue to look at this book of Ezekiel, not covering every chapter and verse, but trying to get a sense of what the whole book is about. If you remember back in chapter 1, we had Ezekiel seeing a vision which God was coming from Jerusalem to him in Babylon on this chariot. Today, we're going to see a vision that sort of is backwards of that in the sense that Ezekiel will be taken to the temple to see what is going on there. And unfortunately, what he'll find there is a bunch of idolatry. But let's go ahead and read the first few verses that we'll cover today. This will come to us, as I said, from Ezekiel chapter 8. It says there, "In the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day of the month, as I sat in my house, with the elders of Judah sitting before me, the hand of the Lord God fell upon me there. Then I looked, and behold, a form that had the appearance of a man. Below what appeared to be his waist was fire, and above his waist was something like the appearance of brightness, like gleaming metal. He put out the form of a hand and took me by a lock of my hair, and the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven and brought me in visions of God to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the gateway of the inner court that faces north, where was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provokes to jealousy. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, like the vision that I saw in the valley." And here indeed we get this sense of what is going on, just in the sense of as you're reading this, you think, wait, didn't I already read this? Well, yeah, in one sense, right? A lot of this imagery is the exact same imagery from Ezekiel 1, and that's intentional because we want to get the point here again quickly of who is coming to talk to Ezekiel, and that, of course, is God. And God is pictured as this fiery man atop this chariot. The only difference here, we should say, is in one way 14 years. 14 years have elapsed. And what we find here is we find Ezekiel the prophet sitting with the elders of Israel, but again, remember, in exile, in Babylon. And so we can say a couple things. One, obviously, he's sort of at this point being recognized as a prophet. In Ezekiel 1, he just receives the call, but here, 14 years later, he's certainly recognized by these elders as being a prophet. That's why they are at his house, we might say. But also we see that there is a governance in exile that's happening. The elders of the exiles are serving in some capacity as elders. And so this is to say that when people go into exile, they don't just completely give up on everything that they had ever known. And particularly, I think we would be wise to look at these elders as faithful elders, part of the remnant that God will speak about, who are trying to do their best to practice their religion, which was so based around the temple, even though now there will be no temple. We know that things changed dramatically in Jewish thought and in the Jewish practice during this period of exile because there was no temple. Just to give you one example, this is why we see in Jesus' day things like Pharisees and Sadducees having such a large role, though before the exile we don't hear of these kind of people. This all happens largely during the exile, and particularly of importance while there is no temple. The priests sort of have a lesser importance for a while, and therefore these other people sort of come to prominence. The next thing we should say, we said there, this is the same man described in the same language, but he's, in this case, the picture is almost funny, but maybe not funny. God comes and he extends his hand and he grabs Ezekiel by his hair and lifts him up, right? Lifts him up into the heavens, or between the earth and the heavens. We don't want to get into here. It doesn't matter exactly what this was. Was he physically transported all the way to Jerusalem? What he says is he was transported there in his visions. And so that's probably best to just leave it there, that whatever this exactly meant, he could then see what was going on in Jerusalem in the temple. Ezekiel gets there, he sees two things. First, he sees what he calls the idol of jealousy. I put here an offensive statue. This is obviously against the first commandment, which forbids graven images. Of course, it's particularly offensive because it's sort of here on the temple complex. Also, it goes against just the specifics of making graven images, that you're not supposed to make anything in the image of a creature at all, that is a particularly offensive thing to God. The other thing he sees is that the glory of God is there, namely this chariot that he had seen in Ezekiel 1. For the purpose of this vision, it is still there in Jerusalem, and that is what he is seeing. And so those two things are there. And you might say in general, if you had another Old Testament story and there was an idol very close to the temple of God and God was there, he might say, I'm going to destroy that idol. It's going to be cast out. He might raise up a prophet who would talk to a king, and the king would say, yes, that has to get out of the holy area of the temple, and they would destroy that idol. That's what we might expect, and then God would remain there. We're actually going to find out. God is going to say, it's true that both can't remain, but at this point in salvation history, the answer is not going to be to destroy the idol and for him to remain, but actually he is going to leave. So we'll talk more about that here in a second. But those are the main things then Those are the main things then that occur in those first 4 verses of Ezekiel. So let us turn back to the next few verses in the scriptures. So here we're just going to read verses 5 and 6. Near the bottom of your screen, it says, Then he said to me, Son of man, lift up your eyes now towards the north. So I lifted up my eyes towards the north, and behold, north of the altar gate, in the entrance, was this image of jealousy. And he said to me, Son of man, do you see what they are doing? The great abomination that the house of Israel are committing here, to drive me far away from my sanctuary? But you will see still greater abominations. All right, so beginning in this section, although we've already seen this idol of jealousy, we're going to see 4 abominations that are going on in the temple in verses 5 through 18, and we're going to divide each of these up. But we should say in the beginning that God keeps saying to Ezekiel, this is terrible, what's going on? But then he'll say, but you're going to see even more terrible things in this vision. And so there's this idea that things become worse with each part of this vision that Ezekiel sees. And I would suggest there's 2 basic ideas going on here that talk about why it's worse. One is that each practice of idolatry seems to be less secret or more brazen. And connected to that is that each one of them seems to be getting closer to the Holy of Holies. Remember, of course, you have the outer courts of the temple, then you have the kind of inner court of the temple, and then you have the temple itself, and inside of that, you have the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant is, where God dwells. So each one of these moves closer and closer to that. It becomes more and more in God's face, we might say. But let's go ahead and look at these first verses 5 and 6 in this section, as we just read. And we'll see here what appears to be an idol of Asherah. If you go back and look in 2 Chronicles 33:7, also 2 Kings 21:7, both of those are nearing the end portion of the time that Israel will spend in the Promised Land, and particularly with the evil king Manasseh. We're told that he allows an image, an idol of Asherah, to be placed here by the temple. And so this is what we see occurring here, even though Ezekiel doesn't tell us who this idol is to. That's most likely from what else we know, that it's Asherah. And realize Asherah is the Canaanite head goddess, right? There's, in most of these pagan religions, there's sort of a head male deity who might be considered the overall head deity, but then usually there's a wife of that deity or goddess of that deity that is very close in power. And many times that goddess ends up dealing with things like fertility, both in regards to human fertility, but also in regards to the ground agriculture. And so Asherah here was that Canaanite goddess that would be up there real high on the ranking, maybe only behind the absolute idol of Baal in, kind of importance. But here's the terrible thing. These are the very idols that when the people of God went into the promised land, they would destroy these Canaanites and their gods so that they would not be influenced to worship these gods. And now what do we find here near the end of their time in the promised land? Not only are they these Canaanites still around, but their gods are still around, and they're so around in the sense that they're right there on the temple complex. And again, God is right to say, this is terrible, and actually this is where he says, this is going to cause me to depart, right? This is not, I'm going to destroy that and remain. He is actually going to depart. So he's speaking here again about the exile, about the fact that he's going to leave the temple behind. And the way that that idol is going to be destroyed is that the whole temple is going to be destroyed. So that's what, again, he says will cause him to have to depart. Let's turn back then to the scriptures and get these next several verses 7 through 13. All right, so here it says, and he brought me to the entrance of the court, and when I looked, behold, there was a hole in the wall. Then he said to me, Son of man, dig in the wall. So I dug in the wall, and behold, there was an entrance. And he said to me, Go in and see the vile abominations that they are committing there. So I went in and saw, and there, engraved on the wall all around, was every form of creeping things and loathsome beasts and all the idols of the house of Israel. And before them stood 70 men of the elders of the house of Israel, with Jezaniah the son of Shaphan standing among them. Each had his censer in his hand, and the smoke of the cloud of incense went up. Then he said to me, Son of man, have you seen what the elders of the house of Israel are doing in the dark, each in his room of pictures? For they said, The Lord does not see us. The Lord has forsaken the land. He said also to me, You will see still greater abominations that they commit. All right, so let's talk about the details here of this second abomination. We have here this idea again that they're going closer to the Holy of Holies. They're sort of in the outer walls of the temple, it appears. And we do know there were rooms sort of right inside the outer walls. And so it's probably the vision here is that Ezekiel's sort of, digging into the outer wall and able to see into these rooms and what they're doing there. So what are they doing there? Well, they're worshiping idols. And you get this picture that on every wall is every idol that anyone in the whole house of Israel is worshiping. And there seem to be a lot of them. Think about this, right? And we're told particularly again that these are images of creatures, of creeping things and loathsome beasts, right? Isn't this interesting here then that what we are really being told is that everything's been turned upside down, right? They're supposed to have only one God, and yet they have many gods. They're supposed to worship the Creator, and yet they're worshiping these creatures. Man is supposed to have dominion over the creatures, and yet now these creatures are being looked at as gods and therefore have dominion over the people. It's really just a horrific thing overall. If there's anything good about this, I guess it's that it's in secret, right? They're not doing this out in the open, and like we said, that kind of idea is going to be important as we go forward, that these things are going to become more brazen, more out in the public. So if there's anything good, that's it. What else do we have there? Well, we have these 70 elders, and most people think, again, when you see 70 in the Bible, it's usually 7 times 10, and 7 times 10 is usually just sort of a huge number of completeness, right? 7 and 10 are both sort of numbers of completeness, so when you put them together, it's kind of all the people. And these, we should say, are the elders here of Israel. And so the elders were those that did represent the lay people, right? They were the representatives of the lay people and not so much of the priests and things like that. So we think what this really is symbolizing here is that this is saying the whole nation of Israel has gone astray, is practicing idolatry. Now, of course, again, we'll be told there is a faithful remnant who mourns what's going on rather than rejoicing in it. But think of this almost like the flood, right? That almost everybody is just doing evil, right? Oh, yes, there's Noah and his family. There's that little remnant. But God is going to destroy the whole world in the flood through water. And now here we're told that basically the whole nation of Israel has gone into idolatry. Oh yes, there is that remnant, but he's about to destroy them, as he told us in the last lesson we did, through things like famine and sword and fire. And so that's what is coming. So we can almost look at this as similar to the flood in the sense of this is probably next to the flood, the greatest act of God's wrath, right? Where he pours out his wrath. And he does so, of course, only after being long suffering, only after intense rebellion. The other interesting thing is we get this Jazaniah in the center of these elders, and we're told who his dad is. And why is that important? Well, his dad is actually the one that when they find the book of the law, King Josiah, who is a good king who tried to reform Israel, he gives the book of the law to this man's father. So he was so trusted by this good king, and here now we have his son doing the exact opposite. He's leading people back into idolatry. And unfortunately, we see this in our own lives, right? That what one generation does, the next generation might do the exact opposite. But this man is particularly sort of loathsome because we are also told in the scriptures of his three brothers, just brief comments on each of them in the scriptures, but they're each doing something to help the faithful reforms in Israel. So he's sort of the black sheep, and by black sheep here we mean the evil sheep, the one who is indeed leading people in the practice of idolatry. We're also told they're using incense here, and that is just kind of a common factor in worship, right? Perhaps your church does not use incense. My church does not use incense very regularly, at least, or if at all. But this is a common practice both in pagan worship and also in Christian worship throughout time, that incense goes up. It's a symbol of the prayers going up. It's also a symbol of sort of putting something pleasing to the nose up into God's nostrils, or up into, for the false religions, up into their God's nostrils. But this is just something we see a lot. There's not a lot to be said there about the incense. Let's go then and look at the next abomination, which takes us to another place in the temple and a different idol that's being worshipped. And here we'll just look at verses 14 and 15. It says, "Then he brought me to the entrance of the north gate of the house of the Lord, and behold, there sat women weeping for Tammuz. Then he said to me, Have you seen this, O man? You will see still greater abominations than these." So here we have this third abomination, and here again we seem to be getting less and less secret. This seems to be much more out in the open, and more likely, again, kind of drawing closer and closer to actually being inside the temple proper. And the women here are shown worshiping this god. What we kind of know about this god, Tammuz, is that it seems that there is a historical figure behind this, a Sumerian king, but who in the minds of the people now is a god, right? He is no longer just a historical figure of the past. He has become a god to be worshipped, and this is common in pagan religion particularly, that men are elevated to the status of being God, particularly rulers. But the interesting thing about him is that he is thought to have been banished to the underworld by his wife. And we hear here that the women are mourning there at this statue, and they're not mourning that the statue's there. Rather, mourning is sort of what you did to worship this god. Why? Well, because the thought was he was banished and he became lifeless. And they associated this then with the change in the seasons, particularly from spring to summer, where you'd go from the wet period of the spring where things are lively and growing, and then you get into the summer where things grow dry and perhaps die. And so they would sort of mourn this king in the hopes that they would not suffer his same fate. That they would not, and they and their crops, I should say, would not grow dormant and die in the arid summer months. But this is what they're worshiping. Probably the religion surrounding this god probably came in from Mesopotamia into Jerusalem. But this is what's going on here. But things are getting worse and worse. So let's then go and look at what unquestionably is the worst of all the worst of these abominations. We'll begin reading in verse 16 and we'll read through verse 18. And he brought me into the inner court of the house of the Lord, and behold, at the entrance of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs to the temple of the Lord, and their faces towards the east, worshiping the sun towards the east. Then he said to me, Have you seen this, O son of man? Is it too light a thing for the house of Judah to commit to the abominations that they commit there, that they should fill the land with violence and provoke me still to further to anger? Behold, they put the branch to their nose. Therefore I will act in wrath, my eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, I will not hear them. All right, so this is that final abomination that Ezekiel is given to see in the temple. And what's going on here? Well, there is sun worship, right? And it's being done right outside the temple itself. And the idea we get here then, of course, is that the temple, in particular the Holy of Holies, is the place where God dwells. And so what are these people doing? Well, they are worshiping the sun with their backs turned to God, their backsides turned to God. We know that sun worship is common in false religions. You know, it's sort of that people easily deduce that the sun is important for life. And so if they're looking for something in creation to worship, the sun is just sort of a likely place for people to turn if they're not turning to the true God. We're told in the Bible that King Josiah, the good king that followed Manasseh, indeed tried to take care of what Manasseh had done. Manasseh had allowed and even sponsored sun worship. And then the good king Josiah sought to end this, but we see here obviously by the point of the exile, after Josiah's reign, unfortunately, this sun worship has returned. As I mentioned, interestingly, the Holy of Holies, right, sat at the west end of the temple, or at least so we believe. And we say so we believe because this is how the tabernacle was set up. It's also how we know Herod's temple was set up. And so we assume it was the same for Solomon's temple, though we don't get this exact detail. Some people suggest that perhaps God ordered his sacred spaces this way, precisely because he knew people were going to be tempted to worship the sun. And so he kind of flipped his sacred spaces around so that when you were worshiping him, you actually had your backs to the sun. We don't know that for sure, but it's an interesting sort of speculation. But the real problem here is that they're disrespecting God in every way. They're being idolatrous. They're getting very close to the Holy of Holies and to the temple itself, and they're turning their backside to God in order to do this. One side note here, note that most of our churches in the West, if they're going to be built with a certain direction in mind, what I'm saying is sometimes there's just practical considerations about why the church building is situated the way it is. But if you sort of have all the options available to you and you study kind of what church history and church architecture would suggest, you would place your altar to the east in Christian worship. Why is that? Well, let's first go the scriptural reasons. One is that Malachi tells us that the Messiah will return like the sun, S-U-N, of righteousness. And so we're looking to the east, just like the sun rises to the east, we're looking there for Jesus. Secondarily, and kind of building on that, Jesus said that when he returned, it would be like a flash of lightning that would strike in the east and go to the west. And so again, we're looking to the east. And of course, we know Jesus rose at dawn when the sun was rising as far as his resurrection on Easter Day. And so it makes some sense to us again to think that he will come back at the dawn when the sun is rising as well. Now, all of those things are not, set down in stone that requires us to face the east. But these are the things that the church has tried to teach by positioning the church a certain way. Now, both of the churches I serve now are not this way. One faces to the north and one faces to the west. I know even the Roman Catholic Church, which would be more likely to follow these instructions in our town, also faces the north. So you won't see this everywhere, but it is interesting that this is flipped from Old Testament times to New Testament times. Some people believe this is actually because the Jews eventually forced out the Christians from their worship spaces, right? They got to a point where they said, if you're going to claim that Jesus is the Messiah, you can no longer worship in our Jewish spaces. And so some people think then the Christians decided to do exactly the opposite with their worship spaces when they started building them. Instead of looking to the west, they would look to the east where they believed, right, Jesus would return. It's kind of an interesting thing just to think through all of that. Also, remember, not only are churches faced that way, but most people are buried with their feet to the east, their head to the west, so that when Christ returns in the resurrection of the body, the idea is you sit up, right, and you see Jesus right away. We're told here that there's kind of three overall big sins going on. There's outright idolatry. There's filling the whole land with violence. And so there's this idea. The first one is God's relationship to the people is broken. And then the violence one is they're broken in relationship with one another to the point where they're murdering one another. And then finally, just this overall idea of the disrespect of doing this in God's holy space. In this, we're told that there are 25 men. Most people think that this represents the priests. One, because they're right there where the priests would do their work. Secondly, we know that the priests were divided up into 24 divisions. And then you'd have the high priest. So these, if you want to get bad again, it's not only the people, it's not only the elders of the people that are involved, it's the priests of the people that are involved as well. The final thing we get here in your translation is going to differ depending on what you're reading, but there's some statement here about holding a stick to their nose or holding a stick to God's nose. And this is notoriously a part of Ezekiel that's hard to even translate and then to figure out exactly what that translation means. But I'm going to give you the four options I found in my study, which is one, this is saying something about they're doing some sort of ritual motion in their sun worship. And that's what's being referred to here. The second is that it's sort of just an idiom that means they're doing it pridefully. We would say they're sticking their nose in the air. Here's another one that some people suggest is that this kind of has a sense of these people's backsides are to God. And so the idea is that they're passing gas, and instead of incense into the nose of God, they're passing gas into the nose of God, a sign of disrespect. The last one is that some translations and some Hebrew manuscripts will give the idea that they're actually kind of shoving a stick right up God's nose, kind of a very violent, kind of as close to the sticking it in your face as you can get, literally sticking it in your face. We don't know exactly which one it is, but let's say that none of these would be good, right? All of these would be disrespectful to God. And so this is what we see here in this last abomination. So overall, so far, we've seen these four abominations going on in the temple that Ezekiel is transported to see. And the point is, things have got so bad in Jerusalem that the exile is coming. And the exile coming means that God is leaving Jerusalem. We kind of knew that already in Ezekiel 1, but here we're shown from a different perspective the same thing. And we're shown very vividly why it is that God is leaving, that people are being idolatrous in just a brazen way towards God. All right, there's a couple of the things that we want to cover real quickly in these chapters from 8 to 11. And the next one occurs in chapter 9, and we'll just read verses 3 and 4 here. It says, "Now the glory of the God of Israel had gone up from the cherub on which it rested to the threshold of the house. And he called to the man clothed in linen, who had the writing case at his waist. And the Lord said to him, Pass through the city, through Jerusalem, and put a mark on the foreheads of the men who sigh and groan over all the abominations that are committed in it. So we want to look at these couple verses here and also the section we'll read next, because obviously we've had a lot of talk of God's wrath and judgment. We've had a lot of talk about Israel's rebellion. But we do get a couple things here that we should stop and rejoice in, namely that there are some faithful people, a remnant, that are going to be saved from this destruction. And the first one in those verses we just read is this idea that these faithful remnant, they're going to be marked with a sign on their forehead. And we know that this sign that they're marked with is the sign Tav. Well, that's kind of saying it in English, translated from Hebrew, but it's the Hebrew letter Tav. And this letter, we know throughout history kind of how it was made in different times in the history of the Jewish people. And so you see this little chart here on your screen, and you notice that the earlier you go, of course, this sign was made very much more like a cross. So therefore, some people see this as a particular prophecy here, that the only way to be saved is by having the mark of the cross upon you. And that's certainly beautiful, and I don't think it's beyond what God wants us to imagine here. But I would say it's similar to when we think of God telling the Israelites to mark their doorposts with the blood of the Lamb. Right? That there was a literal lamb that was slain, and it was their blood. But of course, as we look back on it now, we go, the blood of the Lamb, right? The Lamb of God, Jesus. Same thing here. This sign might have just been seen at the time mostly as marking you with this particular letter for whatever reason. And of course, a cross or an X is something that even today we still kind of mark things with, right? We say sign at the X. So it's possible that this was sort of just a letter they used to mark things in general. But indeed, it's not wrong for us as we look back to say, is this God again showing us in a small way what is to come, that the Messiah is going to come, and only if you have that sign of the cross will you be saved. What we do know is that God marks his people to save them from destruction often. I already talked about how he had the Israelites do that during the final plague there in Egypt. But we can also think of Cain receiving that mark because he complains that he's going to be killed as soon as he goes out anywhere, and God saves him from that wrath and that destruction. We can say that we have this same language in the book of Revelation. The book of Revelation, either you receive the sign of the cross, right, the sign of God, or you receive the sign, the mark of the beast. And so this image is there over and over again. For us Christians, right, this is why it's so beautiful that when we have a Christian baptism, one of the first things we do is we take that child or that adult and we say, I mark you as one redeemed by Christ the crucified. And how do we do that? Well, we make the sign of the cross both upon their forehead and upon their heart to mark them as redeemed. And that's a beautiful picture that ties all these other pictures together, that in baptism we're connected to the cross, and the cross is our salvation from God's wrath. So that's a beautiful picture that we didn't want to miss here in chapter 9. It's also, again, just a reminder that there is a faithful remnant, even though things are so bad, even though we were told, right, 70 of the elders are there worshiping idols, which is, a complete number. There still are a few, and God saves them by marking them. All right, let's go back and look at the final passage of Scripture we want to look at on this video. All right, we're going to read chapter 11, verses 17 through 20. And it says, Therefore say, Thus says the Lord God, I will gather you from the peoples and assemble you out of the countries where you have been scattered, and I will give you the land of Israel. And when they come there, they will remove from it all its detestable things and all of its abominations. And I will give them one heart, and a new spirit I will put within them. I will remove the heart of stone from their flesh and give them a heart of flesh, that they may walk in my statutes and keep my rules and obey them. And they shall be my people, and I will be their God. So in these verses in chapter 11, we get this beautiful promise of restoration, right? All this talk of wrath and destruction. And this is not, of course, empty talk. Indeed, it prophesied the true wrath and destruction that occurred when Jerusalem was sieged and the people were sent into exile. And yet, here again in chapter 11, we get this glimmer of hope. He says he is going to bring back some of that faithful remnant that's been scattered throughout all the nations. The end of the story is not the exile, blessedly. He tells them he's going to restore them, right? That they would have the land of Israel. In other words, that they'd return to that land of Israel, which we know indeed did happen after the exile. But then probably even more importantly, when we look on it holistically, they will also be given new hearts and new spirits. They will become people that don't have hearts of stone anymore, but have hearts of flesh, soft hearts that love the ways of the Lord. And they're going to live then in relationship with God in this new, beautiful way where he's their God, they're his people, they're following his ways. And ultimately, this is messianic talk. This is what God is going to do. He's going to gather the people, he's going to send his Messiah, and through that Messiah, there's going to be new life, new hearts given out as the Holy Spirit is poured out upon all people. The next part of the book will go back to wrath and destruction, but we will want to remember these wonderful promises of chapter 11 when we get near to the end of the book of Ezekiel, where we have this beautiful vision of exactly what this restoration is going to look like. And so for now, we'll just leave it there to say, isn't it great that even in the midst of the talk of wrath, our God is so merciful by nature. It's so central to his character that he can't help, even when he's pouring out wrath, to speak about restoration. Okay, that's where we're going to leave it for this week. We learned today that Ezekiel sees in the temple all these abominations, these terrible things, this idolatrous activity done so brazenly right in the face of God. And because of that, God says he is going to depart. And indeed, he will depart. And yet we're given this hopeful note that there is a faithful remnant that will be marked with almost a cross, perhaps, to save them from the destruction of God's wrath during the time of the siege of Jerusalem and the exile, and then that he will bring back that remnant into Israel, where then we have this messianic kingdom come forth, where God and his people, again, like in the Garden of Eden, live together at peace with one another, him being their God, they being his people, them having these hearts of flesh that love God and love his ways and walk in them. That's what we have for today. I look forward to seeing you again for our next video.